I went back to Quito, went to the Amazon, went up into the mountains to a city called Baños, went down south to Cuenca, and then went out to the Galapagos and back to Quito. So it was a lot of travel. We spent probably too much time in buses on the way. But while I was there, I studied geology and Ecuadorian culture and history. So a quick profile. I'll go through this quick because it's kind of boring. There's about 60 million people, so it's about twice the size of Washington. But the cool thing is about 1 million of those are indigenous people. So indigenous culture is everywhere. It's about the size of Nevada. Its large cities are Quito, the capital, and then Guayaquil and Cuenca are also large, with Guayaquil the largest city. And there's 4 distinct regions in Ecuador. The Costa region, which is the coast, the Sierra region, which is the mountains, the Oriente region, which is the eastern plains and rainforest, and then the Galapagos, obviously the islands. Spanish is the most spoken language, but Quechua is also spoken. So, some cultural norms to expect if you go to Ecuador from my very short experience there. So, these aren't necessarily true everywhere in Ecuador, but from what I experienced, they are. So, if you go to Ecuador and you don't really know any Spanish, you're going to be in trouble because not very many people speak English. Only people who speak English work in the tourist industry. So, I'd recommend having Spanish, or at least knowing some Spanish when going, or going to people who speak Spanish, or making friends who speak Spanish, or else you're going to be in trouble real quick. Toilet paper. So in Ecuador, you do not put toilet paper in the toilet. I'm not sure how prevalent this is in other places in Latin America, but the Ecuadorian plumbing system can't handle toilet paper. So there's a little bin next to the toilet that you put your toilet paper in. That took some getting used to, but you also might have to pay for toilet paper. That's another thing to get used to as well. Next, you don't have to do a currency exchange when you go to Ecuador because they use the US dollar. So that's cool. The most important thing to consider, in my opinion, is how that they do things much slower than we're used to here in the United States, much, much slower. For example, I can think of a time we stopped for lunch about 1. We had enough time to have a group conversation, go through the gift store in the restaurant where you are, and go outside and take some photos. And by that time, it was 3, and we finally got our meal. It took almost 2 hours to get our meal. That takes getting used to because usually you're used to getting like a sit-down restaurant and get your meal in half an hour. So everything tends to be a little bit slower, but honestly, it's kind of refreshing. So views on women and those in the LGBT community. So this picture is a picture of a protest that happened in Ecuador about 3 weeks before I went that was protesting the legalization of gay marriage in Ecuador. Yeah, they had protests with tens of thousands of people protesting gay marriage being legalized. They also protested abortion as well. So there's some gray areas there that you have to consider when you go. But not everyone shares those views in Ecuador, but there are some. Courtesy. It's same as the United States. You shake their hand, greeting, say the right greeting for the time of the day. And in regards to tips, 10% tip is usually good enough. So safety, drinking water. I cannot emphasize that when you go to Ecuador, you need to drink lots of water, but you also need to bring water bottles with you. Because unless you want to be sick your whole trip, you do not want to drink the Ecuadorian water because it's not as filtered as we're used to, so our bodies cannot handle it. So you need to bring large water bottles because most of the places you would have filtered water for you to fill your water bottles so that you can make it through the day. It's also important to drink water because if you're in Ecuador, you're likely to be at a very high altitude, and drinking lots of water helps with adjusting to altitude. So vendors and buskers, like street performers, they'll get right in your face. And that's something I wasn't prepared for. And it wasn't like a bad thing, but they just have a different perception of personal space. And they also will follow you. We were getting a tour of a church, and like a group of about 10 vendors just like encircled our group and waited for our tour guide to be done speaking, and then started yelling at us, trying to sell us their wares. So that was an interesting experience. That's something to be aware of. Pickpockets are something you can consider anywhere in the world. But there was one time that we were watching a festival, and I did see a little 10-year-old kid touching people's back pockets as they're walking through. So it's something to keep in mind as well. Ecuador also has a large population of stray dogs. You will see stray dogs on every street corner everywhere, and do not touch them unless you want a shot in your stomach, because they might bite you because they're not used to human touch, because they've probably been abused. And if you try to peck them in their head, they'll probably bite you, and then you'll have to get a rabies shot, and that's not fun. And then last but not least, altitude. There's a lot to consider with this, like drinking lots of water, taking things slowly, not going too hard with activities, including drinking. Altitude, you'll adjust to it eventually, but it took me the entire 2 weeks. We were in the mountains to adjust, and then we left the mountains, so it was pointless. But altitude is something to consider. Now the fun stuff. Where to go? In Quito, the Teleférico, which is a cable car. It takes you from Quito, which is at 9,000 feet, to the slopes of Pichincha volcano, 13,500 feet. So you're almost a mile above the city. It only costs like $4 to use. It's totally worth it. And it's beautiful. We did, however, do this on our first day, so we just about died because of the elevation. Also, a visit to Old Town Quito is recommended, where you can see a lot of old historic government buildings, churches, and that statue of the Virgin Mary, which can be seen from 100 miles away, literally, because it's on the top of the hill. Also visiting the Guayacimi Museum. If you went to visit an artist who was friends with Che Guevara and has an odd collection of sex art, this is for you. Also art that covers an entire wall. This is highly recommended by me, going about an hour north to Otavalo, which is the heart of indigenous territory and home to the Otavalo indigenous peoples. Here, a large percentage of the world's roses are made. You can find indigenous people making handmade clothing from llama and alpaca wool. If you're lucky like me, you'll get to see the last day of their 2-week summer solstice celebration, which is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. There's also natural beauty as well. Also, if you're going that way, you have to stop at the equator because it's the namesake for Ecuador. And then you can claim that you've stood in 2 hemispheres at one time. That's a pretty cool thing to be able to say you did. And last but not least, Cochasqui, which are pre-Incan ruins. They're almost 1,000 years old. And also this has one of the best views of the entire Quito Valley, in my opinion. So now, since I'm trying to keep this under 5 minutes, a quick summary of the rest of Ecuador, which is quite large. If you go to Ecuador, you obviously have to go to the Galapagos because you're already there. And it's right there. And it's on so many people's bucket lists. And I was lucky enough to be able to go there. I did hear that they doubled the price of admission to get in from $50 to $100 to try to reduce the number of people there, because it's a push and pull of helping preserve the wildlife by having tourists come in and pay, but also not having too many come in so that they ruin nature. But I was lucky enough to go and snorkel for the first 2 times with a lot of wonderful wildlife and see all this wonderful wildlife as well, including the famous giant tortoises. This is highly recommended by me. Honestly, I thought it was cooler than the Galapagos. And yes, that's me with a spider on my head. It's totally harmless, promise. I think our guide called it a fake scorpion. I wish I had another photo of it, but it covers your hand pretty well. So I had it in my hand first. But this eco-lodge was run by the Huaroni indigenous peoples of the Ecuadorian Amazon. It was a 2-hour drive on a very bumpy, rocky road, and then a half-hour canoe ride up a tributary of the Amazon. And it was the most isolated I've by far ever been, because the closest city was 2.5 hours away, and that city had like 100 people, so it's not really much of a city. But here I got to do things like fish for piranhas, eat the piranhas after fishing for them, walk through the jungle, see a lot of cool wildlife, and learn about how the indigenous people lived, and get to eat their food and drink as well. It was a real cool experience. The Andes, they're right down the middle of Ecuador, and you can't miss them, and they're absolutely gorgeous. I mean, a lot of us here are Washingtonians, so I'm sure we all love our mountains, but these mountains are gorgeous. This particular mountain that's shown in the leftmost and center picture is Mount Chimborazo, which technically is the tallest mountain in the world, but by that definition, it's the farthest, the top of it's the farthest from the center of the Earth. We were lucky enough to get as high as almost 16,500 feet up its slopes. So we were about 2,000 feet higher than the top of Mount Rainier at that point. That very thin air, but also very gorgeous. Baños. If you like your typical tourist trap sort of city, this is Ecuador's tourist trap with beautiful waterfalls and rivers and green lush area, and also hot springs. That's like the first time I've ever been to hot springs, and there's so many of them. Even our hotel had hot springs that were included in the night stay. So this is where if you want to go to a resort and just relax or have some adventure, like swinging on this swing on an active volcano or river rafting, et cetera, this is the place to go. Finally, Cuenca, which is the third largest city in Ecuador. You're going to see more of the colonial history of Ecuador here, as you can see with all the red roofs, just like in Spain. And also the, I think there's a city in Spain called Cuenca. I'm not sure. I think that's true. But here this is like the trendy liberal city of Ecuador, where I was able to eat pho, and we saw people dressed much differently than most Ecuadorians wear. I think this is where, if going to school here would probably be the most close to home of any city in Ecuador. So yeah, that's everything I did. I hope if you have any questions, you can ask me when we're asking questions. Gracias a todos para escuchar.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy.
No problem.
Jenna, you are next.
Oops. All right. Can everyone hear me? Or am I still muted?
We can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Oops. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay. So last summer, I spent 7 weeks in Chile. I mean, it was summer here, but it was their winter. That was something like I should have thought about more beforehand. It was actually really cold, but it was still like a super cool experience. I spent most of my time in Viña del Mar and Valparaiso, which are two cities on the central kind of coastal area, about 2 hours from Santiago. So just a little bit about Chile. There are 14 states, 15 if you include Santiago. And yeah, I spent most of my time in Santiago and Valparaiso and Viña del Mar. So while I was in Santiago, we went to San Cristobal, which has a major church that was created during the colonial era. We also got to see the palace, or not the palace, the Capitol building, which was really cool. We got to go on a tour inside. We also got to see a lot of museums that were really important to the history of the city. I'm not sure how much you guys know about history in Latin America with the whole communist revolution, but in the early 70s, late 60s, they had a golpe de Estado, which is where the communist government was overthrown by a militia. And it was like a really horrible time for the country, and it caused a lot of divides in the community. So they had a lot of stuff kind of preserving the memories of those that were either missing or are still missing from that time, or were like murdered by the government. So that's where Salvador Allende lived, in the picture at the top. Then I spent the time with my host family in a city called Viña del Mar. It was right on the coast. It was a pretty nice town, I think. All the people there were super nice. There's lots of things in walking distance, pretty much anywhere I went in Chile, any place you stay. They have a really good metro system and a bus system that'll take you one place or another, and it's relatively cheap. So I think that Chile would be a really affordable place to go if you're looking to study abroad. We also got to see lots of the different kind of art, and there's like Viña del Mar is more of the family area, and Valparaiso, which was where my university was, the city right next door, had a lot more youth and kind of pop culture going on. So it was cool to be able to go back and forth. My host family in Viña, I lived with 2 kids that were my age. So they were able to kind of take me back and forth. So I really enjoyed that. I would really recommend, if you're looking to go abroad, to stay with a host family. It made me feel a lot more comfortable going and doing things. They were able to help me out and kind of explain the ways things worked around there and the customs, which I think definitely helps, especially if you're going alone, like you don't know other people in the program. I think it's a really good thing. So then Valparaiso was the city where my university was, which was, I think, about a 20-minute bus ride from my house and a 25-30-minute metro ride. But Valparaiso is known for the incredible artwork. So it's not graffiti as we think about it here. People spend days and hours painting these murals on the sides of buildings, which is kind of crazy to believe, but almost every building in Valparaiso kind of looks like this. And there's almost a competition between the artists to see who can keep theirs up the longest. So people are constantly recreating, painting. It's really cool. There's, like I said, there's a lot of youth and kind of a younger scene that lives in Valparaiso, which made it really fun to be there. I really, really enjoyed it. I was there studying Spanish and Chilean culture, and so I was able to take a class focusing on that, where we got to go out to the market and practice shopping. And we also got to go to there's a Capitol building, or not a Capitol, a Senate building in Valparaiso that we were able to go to. That was really cool. The other thing, Valparaiso is also right on the beach. So it was nice after classes to go do homework on the beach with your friends or go for a walk in between classes. So I would really highly recommend going to Valpo in Viña del Mar if you're going there. Santiago was really cool. And it's surrounded by the Andes. So when I went and saw the Andes, we stayed in Santiago again for a few days. They have a lot of, like I said, really cool historical history there. But I'm more of an outdoor person. I love nature. I love being by the water and the beach. So that's why I prefer Viña and Valpo. So just a little bit about the food. So in Chile, a lot of people would think that the food would be really maybe like kind of spicy or like what we know about Mexican food, but it was not like that at all. Some of the bigger things that they eat are these things called completos, which are hot dogs. They have these vendors, like, I think almost everywhere, especially right in front of the university. And it's a hot dog with mayonnaise, tomato, and avocado. I never had one because I don't eat meat. When I ordered one, they gave me one with like mushrooms instead of the hot dog. So it was still pretty good, but most people have it with the hot dog. And I heard it was pretty good. It's like their typical fast food. They also eat a lot of empanadas, which I had a lot of. And they have those kind of vendors everywhere. There's some that are sold on the streets. You can also buy them at restaurants and cafes. You can get them at the grocery store to preheat. They're pretty traditional to Chile. And they're also pretty significant in Peruvian culture. There's kind of a rivalry between if the Peruvian empanadas are better than the Chilean empanadas. A typical bar food that I had was the French fry dish called chorrillos. It's just French fries, and then you can just throw on veggies, meats. It's usually with meat, but I had it with veggies, cheese, and egg, which I really, really enjoyed. Another thing that's kind of surprising is in Chile, they don't really eat dinner. They eat something called once. So you have like breakfast, say 8 to 10. You have a big lunch, usually around 1 to 2. And then instead of a dinner, you have this thing called once, where you have bread, cheese, slices of meat, cookies, kind of those things, and coffee or tea. So it's a smaller meal in the evening and a bigger meal during the day, which I personally liked. Some people still do eat dinner. It's just more common to do it the other way. And then the most common meat that they do eat there is chicken. There's always lots of pollo. Sometimes it has different names just because the Chilean dialect of Spanish is a little bit different, but it's pretty common to eat that there. So why did I choose Chile? So Chile has a really unique dialect of Spanish, which as a Spanish student, I was really intrigued by. It definitely made it a little bit harder at first when I was there because even though I had studied Spanish for 3 years, it was really hard to understand people. So that was another good thing, that having a host family another good thing about having a host family was they were able to kind of, we never really talked in English. They weren't super fluent in English, but they could, relate words in Chilean to a traditional Spanish vocabulary. So that was really good. I loved learning about the history and the strength in their community. Like I said, the Golpe de Estado was devastating for the country and all their people. And it was really cool to see how they've risen from that. I know you guys probably all heard about the Chilean protests that were happening in September, October, kind of through the end of last year. They were protesting the new president, and a lot of the people that supported them were people that had supported, a lot of people that were supporting the protests were the people that were supporting Allende in the 70s, or those from that generation, which was really interesting to see how they kind of are all still rising up again. And then the people there were incredible. I never had any issues. I never didn't feel safe. I spent a lot of time with my family, who was super generous. They're always willing to help in my experience. They're very polite. One thing that you do have to kind of be aware of going, I think, into most Latin American countries is their like bandwidth for race. They're not necessarily racist, but they're not as progressive in the way that they talk and stuff. So some of the things they say may be really abrasive or abrupt. And not that it isn't, but there is a cultural difference there that they're not thinking about it as much as we do. So that was something that also took me a little bit to get used to. But overall, I loved my experience, and I would definitely recommend going there. And yeah, so.
Thanks, Jenna. Okay, Quinn.
All right. Well, I've never shared my screen before. I figured this out.
You know how to?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you guys see that?
Yes.
All right. And Igor, if you want to jump in at any point, feel free to unmute yourself and do that, because you probably know a lot too. All right. So I'm presenting on Brazil, and there's a saying about Brazil. It's kind of ironic, but it's Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be. And I like that a lot when I heard that there, so I included it. So here's some basic facts. It's the fifth largest country in the world by area. It's actually larger than the US if you take away Alaska. It takes up about half of South America, so it's gigantic. Sixth largest country by population, eighth largest economy, although there's very high levels of inequality in the country. It has the highest biodiversity of any country in the world, upwards of 200,000 unique species. About almost 10% of the entire count of species that live on Earth can be found in Brazil. The language is Brazilian Portuguese, and this is probably the thing that makes Brazil's culture the most distinct from other countries in Latin America, because it does share a lot of the same similarities in culture and history as they do, but it has a language that's not spoken by any other country in the Western Hemisphere. So it really makes them stand out a little bit in Latin America. And the religion is mostly Roman Catholic, although a lot of the young people that I met were just culturally Catholic and pretty secular. Very brief history. It was mostly colonized by the Portuguese, but also by the French and the Dutch a little bit. That's not as well known. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in the early 1800s, the Portuguese monarchy fled to Brazil, and this resulted in them investing a lot of money into developing Brazil, and eventually it became independent without a war, which is extremely unique in Latin America. Then for a while it was an empire. How do I go back? The United States of Brazil, semi-fascist dictatorship, a populist republic, a military dictatorship, and now it's been a democracy since 1984, I believe. Slavery is a big feature in Brazil's history. There was 600,000 slaves brought to the US, but there was about 4.9 million brought to Brazil, and Brazil didn't ban slavery until 1889. So similar to the US, it's a big part of their history, and it's something that they're still dealing with the impacts of today. Brazil is also a very diverse country. There's a very unique mix of ethnicities that you wouldn't necessarily think of finding in Latin America. There's a lot of Africans, indigenous Americans, Portuguese, Jewish, Spanish, Italians, Germans, Polish, Ukrainians, Lebanese, Syrians, and Japanese. So very diverse ethnicities and culture there. In the early 2000s, their country was experiencing phenomenal economic and social progress, increasing global influence. It was a very big time for them. In 2014, some bad stuff started happening. It's recently been an economic crisis, some corruption scandals, and some political dysfunction, which are still going on to this day. But that about takes us up to the present day. So here's some of the natural features of Brazil that I'm going to run through real quick. This is the flat-topped Mount Roraima, or Mount Roraima, on the border with Venezuela. This is the Amazon rainforest and the Amazon River. The Lençóis Maranhenses flooded sand dunes, which are extremely unique. I don't think there's any other place like that on Earth. Jericoacoara Beach, one of the most famous places in the world for kite surfing. The Fernando de Noronha archipelago off the coast in the Atlantic, which was voted by National Geographic, I think, as having like the best beaches on Earth. Here's the old city of Salvador de Bahia with traditional Portuguese colonial architecture. The Chapada Diamantina National Park. Brasilia, the capital city, which is very famous for its urban planning and its modernist architecture. Ouro Preto, which is one of the oldest towns in the Americas, and for a while was the most populous city in the Americas. It was a gold rush boom town. The Pantanal wetlands on the border with Paraguay, and Sao Paulo, where Igor is right now, the most populous city in the Western Hemisphere. And then this is Iguazu Falls on the border with Argentina. And I got to visit this place. This is crazy. By far the wildest part of nature I've ever seen. And here's Ipanema Beach in Rio de Janeiro, the inspiration for the song, The Girl of Ipanema. And I'll talk a little bit more about Rio because when everybody thinks of Brazil, they think of Rio, and it's a pretty iconic city. It's arguably the most beautiful city in the world. It was the capital of Brazil for almost 200 years, and it's still the center of Brazilian culture. The music, the nightlife, the art there, it's all crazy. Like the murals that you guys were talking about, they've got all those there too. You can just wander around at night and hear bands playing samba. It's just an incredibly vibrant city. There's a lot of contrast there also. You have steep mountains right next to the beach, old colonial buildings, modern skyscrapers, and then some of the richest neighborhoods in Brazil, but also the favelas, which some of you have probably heard of. So it's a lot of contrast in a very small space. And I hopefully have an internship lined up here for after coronavirus when I can travel again. But at this point, who knows when that will be. And here's a picture from Carnival in Rio, which I believe is the biggest party in the world in terms of the people that turn out to celebrate it. It's pretty crazy. I did not get the opportunity to go to Carnival, but next time I'm in Brazil, I definitely will. There's another saying in Brazil, o melhor parte do Brasil é o brasileiro, which is the best part of Brazil is the Brazilian. And this kind of reflects, again, how they have a very unique culture. And I was trying to think of some of the words I would use to describe Brazilians. They're friendly, they're relaxed, they're fun-loving, they're social, physical, passionate, active, beautiful. They're really beautiful, like some of the most beautiful people you'll ever see. Very diverse country and unique as well. And this picture was taken at Pride in Brazil, and you can't see me because it's a gigantic crowd, but I'm somewhere in the back there behind that stage. Another big part of the culture there is dance and music. There's a bunch of genres, some of which are well known, like samba and bossa nova, and then some of which are like very specific to Brazil, and you will never hear outside the country, like sertanejo, which is the Brazilian country music, or reggae, which they call reggae. They have a whole Portuguese language Brazilian reggae, very cool. And then capoeira as well, which is also very famous. It's in this upper right-hand corner here. It's kind of a combination of martial art and dance, and it was invented by slaves in order to teach themselves self-defense without their masters suspecting what they were doing, because it looks like a dance, but it's actually a martial art, but kind of a combination. Some of the other sports they do, there's a lot of sports in Brazil, but these were the ones that stood out most to me. Futebol, or soccer. Everybody knows Brazil has a really good soccer team. They've won the World Cup. I think they're tied with Germany for the most wins of all time. So that's huge there. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu was brought over by Japanese immigrants, and then they developed a unique Brazilian version of it. And today, this is one of the most popular martial arts styles for like MMA. And then surfing, because they have a gigantic coastline. Surfing is super popular there. It's a big part of the culture. This picture here is actually my surfing instructor from the surfing class I took while I was there. And this is her competing in the women's longboard world championships in like 2006. So she's a bit of a local legend. She's really cool. The food in Brazil, rice and beans is an essential staple. People eat rice and beans pretty much every day. And this dish in the upper right here is feijoada, national dish, which is rice and beans and meat. And it's unique to Portuguese colonized countries. There's like all the former countries of the Portuguese Empire all have their own version of feijoada all over the world. They eat a lot of meat in Brazil and seafood if you're by the ocean. And they have churrasco, which is a type of barbecue that you see in the bottom right, where you just grill meat in like this outdoor kind of like brick oven that a lot of people have out on their patios. And you have like a big social event and people come eat, and it's a great way to meet people. They have a lot of fresh fruit there, as well as acai. That's where acai bowls were invented. They do it way better than we do. Baked goods, also super popular in Brazil. This bottom left here, this is pão de queijo, which is the national snack. It's this delicious like cheese pastry thing. They sell them everywhere. There's a strong Italian influence on Brazilian food too, because there's a lot of Italian immigrants. So you see a lot of like pastas and pizza there. A lot of buffets where you can go get food by the kilo. It's good for traveling on the cheap. The food is not very spicy. I did bring my own hot sauce, and I would definitely recommend that if you're a person that likes spice, because spice is not very common in the food there. And there's some questionable food choices. I would say overall the food is pretty good, but they have stuff that will definitely throw you off coming from America. Like they have pizza where the crust is stuffed with cream cheese, and the like pizza sauce they use is often like not very saucy. Like we're used to a decent amount of tomato sauce, and often they have like more of a bare minimum. So there's definitely some culture shock with the food. So this is the place that I studied in Brazil, Florianopolis. I've got some maps here to help you out because literally no one has ever heard of it before. It's the capital of Santa Catarina, which is a state in southern Brazil. It's about 500,000 people. So for Brazil, that's not a terribly large city. It's one of the safest and most developed cities in Brazil. And there's a lot of rich history and legends on the island. The island's nickname is Ilha da Magia, which is Island of Magic. And there's a lot of stories about like witches and sorcery, and it's pretty cool. There's like legends about the different places on the island. It has a subtropical climate. It's pretty rainy. It's kind of like the Northwest, except like significantly warmer. But there's a lot of rainstorms, a lot of gray days because you're right on the ocean. There's at least 42 beaches, depending on how you count beaches. Some people say there's up to like 60 some, but 42 is the most commonly accepted number. And there's a lot of different unique areas and stuff to do on the island. In the north, you have concerts, clubs, resorts, condos. That's like, if you have money, that's where you go. The center of the island is where the universities are, and then like the best restaurants and shopping and museums and the cultural stuff. And then if you go to the east of the island, that's water sports and bars and hostels and like artisans making crafts. That's where you go if you don't have money. And then the south is a lot of hiking and like rural fishing villages. You can get the fresh seafood there. So it's like all different unique areas, which means that I didn't really do a ton of travel off the island because I had stuff to do all the time. I was never bored here. So here's some of the top places on the island. This is Praia and Gaeta. Praia is one of the best surf beaches on the island. And then Gaeta, the one behind it, is the only clothing optional beach. Here's some of the traditional Portuguese colonial architecture that you see around town, which I think is really beautiful. Those of you that have been to Latin America before, you'll notice it's very similar to Spanish colonial architecture, but with a little more like spunk to it. They really go for some crazy colors, especially the like pinks. This is the Ilha do Anhatomirim, which is a Portuguese colonial fort that was built up on a smaller island off the coast that I had the chance to visit. And it's overrun by wild capybaras now. If you guys don't know what capybaras are, look it up right now. It's the world's largest rodent. It's like a hamster the size of a golden retriever. They just roam over the island and they keep the grass trimmed. They're like living lawnmowers. This is another island off the coast, Ilha do Campeche, which has the clearest waters on the island. It's almost like Caribbean levels of blue. Here's a couple of the different neighborhoods. On top is Bajada Lagoa, which is built at the entrance of a canal that connects the saltwater lagoon to the ocean. And then below that is Anmasao, which is a smaller fishing village down in the south part of the island. So a lot of people's lives is based around water here because they live so close to it. And this is another neighborhood, Costa da Lagoa, which can only be accessed by boat or by a trail through the jungle, no roads. And then speaking of things that are very difficult to access, this is the best hike on the island, Lagoinha do Leste, also only accessible by boat or by a very arduous hike. But once you get in here, you're rewarded with this gigantic hidden beach and like a freshwater lake behind it. And it's just so isolated and beautiful there. It's incredible. A little more about my experience in Brazil. So I did a homestay as well for about 4 months. The homestay definitely helped me learn the language better, but I would not say that it was one of the high points of my experience in contrast to what a lot of other people have said about theirs. It was definitely not bad, but it was not one of the best parts. When I got to Brazil, American Airlines lost my bag for a week, so I got $200 worth of free clothes from the mall there. That was a good way to start off. Some of the low points, I was a little underwhelmed by the food. The weather was fairly cold when I got there. I didn't really realize that they had winter in Brazil, but when you're far enough in the south, you do get some cold weather. I was living farther from the beach than I was hoping to. My laptop broke. The bureaucracy in airlines there are very difficult to deal with. And I got a mild tropical skin disease, but it got better quickly. And the high points were literally everything else. I visited Buenos Aires for 6 days. I went to Rio for 3 days. I wish I could have stayed there longer. I went to Iguazu Falls for 6 days, and I went to Paraguay for like 2 hours while I was there. A little underwhelmed. I went to the world's second largest Oktoberfest, which you would not expect to find in Brazil. It was in a little like farming community in the countryside that was founded by Germans. So it was pretty crazy. Like you could swear that you were in Germany, but in the hot Brazilian countryside. And I visited at least 26 of the 42 beaches on the island. Hopefully I will go back and do the rest someday. On average, I would say I had about 3 parties, 2 hikes, and 4 trips to the beach per week, but varied significantly. I became conversationally fluent in Portuguese within pretty much 2 months, which was shockingly fast because I had really never spoke it before I got there. But it really helped to learn the language because it helped me get a lot more like immersed in the culture and meet more Brazilians. I learned a ton about the politics of Brazil and Latin America because I'm a political science student. So I was just talking to everyone I could there, just trying to soak up information. Made friends from at least 13 countries, mostly Brazilians. Brazilians are very friendly. It's you can just go up to anyone essentially and talk to them, and like they'll be your friend. They'll start inviting you to stuff. It's crazy. And then I got several job offers and other opportunities just from going there and traveling around, which I was not expecting. So that was pretty cool. And that's all I got. Any questions? How do I turn this off?
There's a button at the top, or it should be near the top of the screen that says.
Oh, I see it. Yeah.
Do you see it?
Yeah.
Well, I can stop it for you. Okay, there we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
People can unmute themselves now. They would like. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Man, it inspires me to go traveling.
I don't know why the sand dunes are flooded like that. I just saw your question. That's a good question, though.
Igor gave me an answer to it. He said it's not water.
Yeah, it's actually not water. So the wind, when the wind blows, it pushes the sand, so it makes those dunes. And when the sun hits, it makes the small sense of a water, but it's not really water.
Igor, how did I do? Was that information pretty accurate?
Yeah, dude, you're great, honestly.
Thank you.
And he said that the Portuguese love the pink. Look at my shirt.
Oh, you're dead right about that, Quinn. My entire street in Lisbon was pink. The entire
I love it.
Awesome.
Hannah, for your question, background in Spanish definitely helps in Portuguese. A lot of people say that Portuguese is drunk Spanish, which is semi-accurate, but the grammar is exactly the same.
Yeah, no, learning the words, speaking it didn't help me with personally because the pronunciation was just vastly different.
Well, I get that question a lot from students. They're like, well, I have a background in Spanish. If I have a foundation, am I going to be able to pick up Portuguese okay? Am I going to be able to navigate okay? They're nervous about that. And having not been there, I just am like, well, talk to someone from modern and classical languages. But I'm just curious on your student experiences with that.
My experience is I can like read some Portuguese. Like if I see it on my phone, like in a post or something, I can read it. But if somebody was speaking it, I think it'd be a lot harder.
I can try. No, just kidding.
Speaking is a big jump, especially the words get a lot more really, really slurred in my experience with hearing Portuguese. However, I can't speak for Brazilian Portuguese since I can't understand Brazilian Portuguese at all.
It depends on the accent. In Florianopolis, people really swear the S is hard. They go like Florianopolis.
Yeah, that's what the sh make it, so many sounds that make sh. It's hard to tell what letter they're saying sometimes. Yeah, got used to it though. Summary Spanish does help some.
Yeah. Brazil is also a really good country to learn a language in because people are very enthusiastic in talking to you. Even if you talk like a 2-year-old, they're very excited that you're learning the language.
That's awesome.
Oh.
I can say something very quickly. First of all, the pizza in Brazil is delicious. That's all.
It's cream cheese and pizza. That sounds really good to me.
It's too much cheese, I find. It's like a cheese overload. But some people really like it.
We eat hot dogs with cream cheese in Seattle. It's not that far off.
It's funny because Brazilians in the US, we don't like the pizza in America, but in Brazil, pizza is like, wow. For us, of course.
Igor, do you put ketchup on your pizza?
I don't, my brother does.
Ketchup on pizza is big in Brazil. I'm also not a fan of that.
What?
Yeah.
When I was in Chile, they put ketchup on fajitas, like the chicken with all the onions and stuff, and like wrapped it into a burrito. I couldn't really get behind that, but
Oh, also by the way, piranhas just taste like fish. They're very, very bony fish. They have way too many bones.
Interesting. Is that like a common thing for them to eat, or is that just
No. That was a total novelty for being in the jungle.
Gotcha.
Since only the eastern part of the country has piranhas, and most of them live in the mountains, so it'd be expensive to transport them. Only people on the coast or in the Amazon eat fish. People in the mountains don't eat fish at all.
Yeah. On the other hand, in Brazil, it's pretty common. We usually make a soup with it, and it's really good. And if you like fishing, with the piranhas, yeah. And if you like fishing, you gotta like put the hook in the middle of the fish so you can fish it. Because if you just put it like on the mouth, the piranha, they cut off the entire body, but they leave the head. So that's just a fun fact.
Interesting.
Oh, also, when I was fishing for the piranhas, I was lucky enough when I was holding it, it had its last life burst while I was holding it. I just about crapped my pants.
It had its last what?
It pulsed in my hands. It had its last. It was dead, but it had its last final key. I was holding it under its gills, and I just about died.
Scary.
There's a photo of me holding it, smiling, and then a photo of it on the floor after I dropped it.
That's awesome. I know it's 5 right now. If people need to leave, they totally can. But does anyone else have any other questions that they're dying to ask or comments they want to share?
Yeah, Florianopolis is definitely more expensive than some parts of Brazil, but it's also not as expensive as Rio or probably as Sao Paulo too. I didn't spend much time there, but it's probably in like the upper range of expensive. It also really depends where you are on the island too, because there's like a rich people part and like a normal people part.
Interesting. The islands looked really pretty.
It's
Or not
incredible.
What?
It's incredible. It's pretty much like a tropical paradise island, subtropical.
Was it hard for you to travel around Brazil when you were there? Like, was it?
A little bit, just because it's such a gigantic country. It's not like Europe where you can like get on a train and take a weekend trip. Like I could take like an overnight bus if I wanted to go somewhere, but even still, it's like a long way to go anywhere just in the south of Brazil. Like there was no way I was going to get up to the north parts of the country, and the airline industry is terrible there. Tickets are far too expensive.
Dang. So would you say the best, like, cheapest form of transportation is bus?
Yeah, definitely the cheapest, but you gotta understand that you're going over vast distances. I was never like upset that I didn't travel that much though, because I mean the island itself was pretty big. So like if you wanted to go like do a hike like the end of it or something, that was like a full day by itself if you like take the bus there.
Interesting. Hannah asked, so students should plan to travel before they go rather than wing it there. They should budget. Is that true?
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely plan out if you want to like travel after the program before you go, just to get the logistics in place.
Did you travel after your program or did you travel during it?
I traveled during it, and then I went to like the optional trip to Iguazu Falls afterward. I wanted to stay and travel more, but I had winter quarters starting literally like 2 weeks after the end. So I had to get home and get moved into a new house in Bellin.
Gotcha. Yeah, Brazil looks amazing. I want to go.
Highly recommend it.
Here's someone typing.
Well, mine was travel throughout because mine wasn't a traditional, like I'm attending a university and classes and doing a homestay. But the travel in Ecuador, if I want to talk about it, what I know about it is that it's very cheap to travel in Ecuador except for flying to the Galapagos is really expensive. But the only thing about Ecuador is it takes really long to get anywhere because all the roads are windier than any road. The road we took that took us from 14,000 feet down to sea level in about an hour, and probably had hundreds of switchbacks. So that's something I should have. If you get sick easily, take Dramamine, or else you will die.
Man, that is me.
That's amazing.
Over.
Also, for the Galapagos too, you're likely to take 2-hour-long boat rides. Take your Dramamine to Ecuador. That's for sure.
Oh my gosh. What about you, Jenna? Did you travel throughout?
Yeah, I went to Santiago for a weekend and then went to the Andes and we did like a hot springs tour. It was really cool. We got picked up at like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. from the place we were staying, and they drove us like up the mountain. And it was only, I think, me, like the 3 friends I had, and 2 other people that went. So it was pretty small. And then we like went to a waterfall in the mountains too, and had like a dinner, kind of lunch, like late lunch, early dinner, and it was pretty cool.
Cool. Igor, have you traveled throughout Brazil quite a bit?
Yeah, I have. I've been pretty much everywhere in Brazil. Yeah, I like traveling around. It's pretty cool. Yeah. If you guys have any
You've
questions.
been to Florianópolis?
Yes. So usually when your class graduates from high school, everyone goes either to Florianópolis or a small island called Porto Seguro, and they just party over there for like 3 days in a row, and that's crazy.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
That sounds very traditional.
I do have my favorite sports. Of course, I like soccer. I like ultimate frisbee. I like volleyball, basketball, and I used to swim a lot. Oh, also, Gwen, you said that Brazil was tied with Germany in the World Cups. Actually, Brazil has one more, and we're really proud of it.
Oh, nice. Man, I'm sorry I misspoke.
Don't worry.
What are like your favorite places in Brazil, Igor?
Florianopolis is up there. I really like it. Salvador, another picture that that Quinn showed everyone. It's really awesome as well. The food in there is really, really strong, really strong. And the culture, I really like the culture over there because it's so Salvador was hit by slavery really hard, and the culture has been influenced by it really, really well. So you have like a lot of African culture in it. It's really awesome. I love it there. And the story that Quinn said about capoeira is 100% correct. And also feijoada, the dish that it's there, it's also made by slaves, and they brought it into the rest of the Portuguese-speaking countries as well. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Question: Do they have pastel de nata in Brazil?
Do they have
That's the
what?
Pastel de nata.
Oh yeah, yes we do. It's
Okay.
a Portuguese dish, isn't it?
I figured you guys must.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
But they had pão de queijo as well.
It's good.
It's good. I agree.
You asking me or? Go ahead. Okay, so I studied there like my whole life, but once I started college, I moved to America. So I can't speak much about my college life in Brazil because I haven't really any. My brother, all of them, they study here. But I'd say the biggest difference is the school year, because our school years go from January to December, and we have a break in July. While in America, it's from September to July or June. So I would say for me, that's the biggest difference.
I'd say one of the main things I noticed at college in Brazil was, well, they were on strike for a good portion of the time that I was there, because there's some stuff going on with the higher education system right now where the Brazilian government is defunding it and like unsubsidizing the school lunches there. So the students are very upset, and they were protesting for like several weeks while I was there. And at one point they blocked the stairs in the building with like chairs and desks so you couldn't get up to the classrooms. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that leads me to another point where in Brazil there is a big difference between private school and public school. Public school, no matter like what level of schooling you're having, it's 100% free. So we have free college in Brazil. But the problem is the government may cut funds pretty often, and of course the students don't like it. While in private sectors, they're always having class and they're always really serious about some stuff. But in Brazil, we have a type of ACT. It's called ENEM. And once a student graduates from high school, they take the ENEM and they see if they can fit into a public school or a private college. And usually public schools are better than private in Brazil.
Cool. Thank you guys all for sharing. Does anyone else have any more questions or comments they want to share before we head out? I'm going to take that as a no. Speak now or hold your peace. Cool. Okay, well, thank you guys all for coming. Thank you, Igor.